Most cheap guns will destroy their barrel in under 5,000 rounds. And if you are just a weekend shooter burning through ammo at the range, that is fine. You buy a new barrel or you buy a new gun, no big deal. But here is the scenario I want you to think about today. What happens when the supply does not come back? What happens when there is no gun store, no online retailer, no replacement parts for 10 years straight? Because in a real long-term SHTF situation, the gun that breaks is the gun that gets you killed. And most preppers are making the same critical mistake. They are judging a survival gun by its price tag, not by its metallurgy. Today, we are fixing that. I have built this list around one brutal standard, which budget guns are engineered to survive a decade of hard use without needing a single replacement part. We are going deep into chrome-lined barrels, gas system fouling rates, bolt carrier wear, and receiver alloy composition. This is not about what looks cool. This is about what keeps running when everything else fails. And stay with me until the end, because the number one gun on this list has a Garand action heritage that almost nobody in the prepper community talks about: a chrome-lined barrel from the factory and a gas system so clean it almost never needs a deep scrub. It is hiding in plain sight, and it might be the most underrated long-term survival rifle ever built on a budget. Let's get into it. Number 8, Mossberg 500 or FIVA90. Before we talk about barrels and bolt carriers and gas systems, I want to start with a principle. The most durable firearm mechanism is the one with the fewest moving parts. And when you apply that principle, the answer almost always leads you to a pump-action shotgun, specifically the Mossberg 500, or its military-grade sibling, the FIVA90. Here is why this matters from a pure engineering standpoint. Every semi-automatic firearm, or recoil-operated, has a system that harvests energy from a fired round and uses it to cycle the action. That system has seals, pistons, ports, rings, and springs that wear down over time, especially under sustained fire and field conditions. The pump action has none of that. You are the operating system. You provide the energy to cycle the action manually, which means there is zero gas system to foul, zero piston to wear, and zero timing to go out of spec. The Mossberg 500 receiver is made from aluminum alloy, lightweight, corrosion-resistant, and structurally sound for the pressures a 12-gauge generates. The barrel is carbon steel, and while it does not come chrome-lined from the factory on most civilian models, the chamber and bore on a properly stored Mossberg will outlast most of the guns on this list. In terms of raw round count before erosion becomes a real concern, shotgun chambers operate at significantly lower pressure than rifle chambers, typically around 11,000 psi for standard double-aught buck loads compared to 55,000 psi for a 5.56 NATO round. That pressure differential means your barrel is under a fraction of the thermal and mechanical stress every time you pull the trigger. The FIVA90, specifically the one with the heavier barrel and metal trigger guard, is what the U.S. military chose for close-quarters combat use. It passed the Mil-Spec 3443 Echo testing protocol, which includes exposure to sand, saltwater, and temperature extremes. That is not marketing language. That is a government document saying this shotgun functions in conditions that would destroy lesser firearms. For long-term treks to SHTF, the Mossberg 500 or FIVA90 gives you a platform that can run slugs for deer at 100 yards, double-aught buck for defense, and birdshot for small game, all from the same gun, all without a single gas port to clean. Street price sits comfortably under $400 for the 500 and under $600 for the FIVA90. For a first-year survival platform that is hard to argue with, number 7, Ruger 1022. I know what some of you are thinking. A 22 on a SHTF survival list? Shouldn't we be talking about stopping power? But let me reframe how you are thinking about this, because the preppers who dismiss the 1022 are making a fundamental error in long-term resource economics. In a decade-long grid-down scenario, every round you fire is a round you need to replace, or have all 30 caliber rifle round. Costs roughly $1 at current prices when bought in bulk. A 22 LDAR. Round costs between 4 and 8 cents. You can store 10,000 rounds of 22 LDAR in the same physical volume and weight as roughly 800 rounds of 5.56 for hunting small game rabbits, squirrels, birds, which will realistically be your primary protein source in a long-term survival scenario. The 22 LDAR is not just adequate, it is optimal. Now let's talk about why the Ruger 1022 specifically, and not just any 22 rifle. The 1022 receiver is cast from aluminum alloy and has been in continuous production since 1964. That is over 60 years of refinement. And more importantly, over 60 years of aftermarket parts production. The rotary magazine system Ruger designed for this rifle is one of the most reliable feed systems ever put into a rimfire platform. The rounds sit in a star-shaped rotor at a consistent angle, eliminating the feed failures that plague box magazines with rimfire ammunition. The barrel on a standard 1022 is cold hammer forged carbon steel with a recessed crown, the crown being the most critical part of the barrel for accuracy preservation. A recessed crown sits slightly inside the muzzle end of the barrel, protecting the rifling from the dings and scrapes that come from field use. When that crown gets damaged on a conventional barrel, accuracy degrades immediately and permanently. Ruger's design protects it passively. The action itself is semi-automatic, running on a simple blowback design, meaning there is no gas system. Like the Mossberg, this eliminates an entire category of long-term wear. The bolt is driven rearward purely by the rearward pressure of the fired case, and a recoil spring drives it forward again. The parts count is remarkably low. The parts are robust, and individual components can be sourced from dozens of manufacturers, even in degraded supply chain conditions, because of how popular this platform is. At under $300, the Ruger 1022 is not a compromise. It is a .22 caliber machine that will still be running clean when guns costing 3 times as much have fouled their gas ports into uselessness. Number 6, SK. If you want to understand why this SK belongs on a long-term durability list, you need to attend the conditions it was designed to survive. It is 1945. The Soviet Union has just fought the most brutal land war in human history across mud, ice, swamp, and rubble. Their weapon designers, and specifically Sergei Simonov, are tasked with creating a semi-automatic battle rifle that can function in the hands of soldiers who may not clean it for weeks, who are operating in sub-zero temperatures, who have not trained to lubricant. The result is the SKs, and it is one of the most overbuilt, over-engineered budget rifles ever made. Let's start with the barrel, because this is where the SKs earns its place on this list. Most original military surplus case rifles, particularly the Soviet Yugoslavian and Chinese Type 56 variants, come with chrome-lined barrels from the factory, not as an upgrade, as a standard specification. The Soviet military understood something that a lot of American budget gun manufacturers still have not fully internalized. Chrome lining is not a luxury feature. It is a durability multiplier. Here is the metallurgy. A chrome-lined barrel has a layer of electrode-posited chromium applied to the bore and chamber. Chromium has a Vickers hardness rating of around 1000 HVV compared to roughly 200 HVV for the carbon steel underneath it. That means the surface your bullet contacts and your gases erode is approximately 5 times harder than the steel it is protecting. The result is dramatically reduced throat erosion, the area just ahead of the chamber where heat and pressure are most intense. On a non-chrome-lined barrel, in hard use, throat erosion is the primary mechanism of accuracy degradation. On a chrome-lined barrel, that process slows down so significantly that military chrome-lined barrels routinely last 20,000 rounds before accuracy begins to suffer. The gas system Simonov designed for the SKs is also worth examining. The SKs runs on a long-stroke gas piston system. The piston is physically attached to the bolt carrier and travels the full length of the operating stroke together with it. This design is mechanically simpler than the short-stroke piston systems used in later designs, and it is more tolerant of carbon fouling, because the longer stroke generates more force to overcome any resistance from dirty conditions. It is not as refined as later designs, but refinement is not the same as reliability. In a long-term survival context, you want the system that keeps running dirty, and the long-stroke piston is that system. The fixed 10-round internal magazine is often criticized as a tactical limitation, and from a competition or military standpoint, that criticism is fair. But from a durability standpoint, it is actually an advantage. There are no magazine feed lips to deform, no detachable magazine springs to lose, and no magazine bodies to crack. The feed system is integral to the rifle itself and protected inside the action. You load with stripper clips, which are simple, flat pieces of stamped steel that will last essentially forever. Yugoslav and Russian surplus case rifles can still be found in the $300 to $500 range from private sellers and some dealers for a chrome-lined, proven, long-stroke piston battle rifle. with a 60-year track record of functioning in conditions that would challenge any modern polymer-framed carbine. That price is remarkable. Number 5. Ruger American Rifle. Now we shift gears completely from semi-automatic battle rifles to something that operates on an entirely different philosophy of durability. And that philosophy comes down to one simple fact: you cannot wear out a gas system that does not exist. The bolt-action rifle is the oldest repeating rifle mechanism still in mainstream production, and it has survived for over 150 years, not because nobody invented anything better, but because for a specific set of priorities: accuracy, reliability, and mechanical longevity. Nothing has genuinely surpassed it. When you cycle a bolt-action rifle, you are directly manipulating the locking and unlocking of the breech with your own hand. There is no gas port tapping propellant gases from your barrel. There is no piston traveling down a tube. There is no bolt carrier group racing backward under spring tension. There is a bolt, a receiver, a barrel, and your hand. That is it. The Ruger American Rifle takes that mechanical simplicity and packages it into one of the most intelligently engineered budget bolt actions on the market today. Let me walk you through what Ruger actually did here, because the engineering decisions are not accidental. The receiver on the Ruger American is made from aluminum not as a cost-cutting measure, but as a deliberate choice that actually improves long-term corrosion resistance over a traditional steel receiver. Aluminum does not rust. In a decade-long scenario where your rifle may be stored in imperfect conditions, exposed to humidity, or used in wet environments without access to proper drying equipment, a non-rusting receiver is a meaningful durability advantage. The steel barrel drops into the aluminum receiver via Ruger's proprietary power bedding system. 2 steel pillars embedded in the stock that contact the receiver, directly creating a stable, consistent interface between barrel and stock that does not shift with temperature changes or stock swelling from moisture. The barrel itself is cold hammer forged steel. Cold hammer forging is a manufacturing process where a barrel blank is formed by hammering it around a mandrel at room temperature, as opposed to hot forging or simple drilling and rifling. The cold working process actually increases the grain density of the steel, making the resulting barrel harder and more resistant to wear than a conventionally rifled barrel of the same steel specification. Ruger uses this process across most of their rifle barrel production, and it is one of the reasons Ruger barrels consistently outlast barrels from manufacturers using conventional button rifling on equivalent steel. The Marksman adjustable trigger on the Ruger American is another long-term durability feature that does not get enough attention. The trigger pull is user adjustable between 3 and 5 pounds without any gunsmithing, which means if the trigger spring takes a set over years of use and the pull weight changes, you can recalibrate it yourself in the field with a simple hex key. No gunsmith, no replacement parts, just adjustment. Available in calibers from .243 Winchester through .308 Winchester and .65 Creedmoor, the Ruger American gives you access to some of the most widely stocked rifle calibers in North America. In a supply-degraded environment, commonality of caliber is a survival feature. The .308 Winchester in particular is chambered in military rifles, hunting rifles, and precision platforms across dozens of countries, meaning ammunition compatibility and potential scavenging opportunities are higher than almost any other rifle cartridge. Street price for the Ruger American sits between $400 and $500 depending on caliber and configuration. For a cold hammer forged, aluminum receivered, mechanically bulletproof bolt-action platform with a field adjustable trigger that is genuinely exceptional value for a long-term survival investment. Number 4. CZ75. Let me stop the long gun conversation for a moment, because there is something missing from every SHTF gun list I have ever seen, and it is a gap that would get you killed in a real decade-long survival scenario. Nobody talks about the handgun. Think about how you actually move through a long-term grid-down environment. You are not carrying your rifle at the low ready 24 hours a day while you are processing firewood, cooking food, tending a garden, or moving through a vehicle. Your long gun is slung, stored, or staged, and the gun on your hip is the one that will actually save your life in an unexpected close-range encounter. Ignoring handgun durability in a SHTF list is not being tactical. It is leaving a critical gap in your survival system. So why the CZ75, and why does it belong on a budget durability list alongside rifles that cost the same or more? The CZ75 was designed in Czechoslovakia in 1975 by František and Josef Kuki and it has been in continuous production with refinements but without fundamental redesign for 50 years. That longevity is not marketing. It is a durability proof of concept demonstrated across 5 decades of military, police and civilian use in dozens of countries under conditions ranging from tropical humidity to desert heat to Eastern European winters. Here is what separates the CZ75 from a durability standpoint. The frame is all steel, not polymer, not aluminum steel. A CZ75 fully loaded weighs approximately 2.5 pounds, and a meaningful portion of that weight is the structural steel that makes this pistol one of the most mechanically robust handguns ever mass-produced. Steel frames do not flex under recoil the way polymer frames do. They do not develop frame rail wear at the same rate. They do not crack under sustained high-volume fire. The rail inside frame design, where the slide rails right inside the frame rather than outside as on most pistols, creates a tighter, more supported lockup that maintains accuracy and function far deeper into the round count than conventional designs. The barrel is cold hammer forged steel with a standard non-chrome lined bore, which is the one durability concession in this design compared to some military pistols. However, the 9mm cartridge operates at significantly lower pressure and temperature than rifle cartridges, which means bore erosion is dramatically slower. A CZ75 barrel running standard pressure. 9mm ammunition will comfortably survive 50,000 rounds before the bore becomes a meaningful accuracy concern, and 50,000 rounds of 9mm represents an enormous stockpile by any realistic survival standard. The mechanism is a short recoil, tilting barrel design derived from the Browning pattern proven across literally hundreds of millions of pistols manufactured worldwide. The parts are simple. The tolerances are forgiving enough to function when dirty, and CZ has maintained extraordinary parts consistency across decades of production. A small part from a CZ75 manufactured in 1985 will fit a CZ75 manufactured today. That interchangeability is a long-term durability feature that almost no other pistol can match across a 50-year production window. Current street price for a standard CZ75BD runs between $500 and $600, making it one of the last all-steel cold hammer forged combat pistols available at anything resembling a budget price. When polymer pistols are selling for the same money, the CZ75 represents a genuinely rare opportunity to buy something that was engineered to last generations rather than product cycles. And before we get to the top 3, I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever completely worn out a barrel, cracked a bolt carrier group, had a gas piston seize from carbon buildup after a sustained firing session? What is the highest round count you have ever personally put through a single gun without replacing any internal components? Drop that number in the comments below, because this community has real-world data that no spec sheet can give you, and I genuinely want to know what the hard-use ceiling looks like from the people actually putting rounds downrange. Tell me your highest round count gun and what finally gave out on it. Let's build that data set together. Number 3, Xeon 15. Now we are getting into the top 3, and the guns from here forward share one characteristic that separates them from everything below. They are built to military-adjacent standards while being priced for civilian budgets. That gap between are actually built to is where the long-term survival value lives. The Xeon 15 is an R15 platform rifle manufactured by Israel Weapon Industries, the same company that makes the Taver the Glace and supplies rifles to the Israeli Defense Forces. Does not have a consumer brand mentality. They have a defense contractor mentality applied to a civilian product, and the difference shows up immediately when you start looking at the specifications. Let's start with the barrel, because this is the core of the durability argument. The Xeon 15 ships with a cold hammer-forged barrel, not cut-rifled, but hammer-forged. We talked about what cold hammer forging does to steel grain density when we covered the Ruger American, and the same physics apply here. The steel is denser, harder, and more resistant to throat erosion than a conventionally manufactured barrel of equivalent specification. II specs their barrel steel to military standards, which means the alloy composition, heat treatment, and dimensional tolerances are held to the same standards used in rifles that have to function in combat. But the barrel manufacturing method is only half of the durability equation. The other half is the bolt carrier group. And this is where a lot of budget R15 manufacturers quietly cut corners in ways that do not show up until you are 3,000 rounds into a hard-use rifle. The bolt carrier group on the ZN-15 is manufactured from Carpenter of 58 steel, the same steel specification used in U.S. military M16 and M4 bolt carrier groups. Carpenter of 58 is a chrome moly vanadium steel that is specifically optimized for the fatigue resistance required in a bolt carrier group application. The bolt face, which cycles through the highest stress concentration in the entire operating cycle, every single time the rifle fires, needs steel that can absorb millions of stress cycles without developing microfractures. Carpenter on 58 is that steel. A lot of budget R bolt carrier groups are made from 8620 steel, which is a fine general-purpose steel, but it is not Carpenter in 58, and that difference accumulates over a long round count. The bolt itself on the ZN-15 is also high-pressure tested, meaning each individual bolt is proof-fired with an overpressure round before leaving the factory, and any bolt that shows signs of stress at proof pressure is rejected. This is a military standard quality control step that many budget R manufacturers simply do not perform. The lower receiver is forged from 77F6 aluminum, the same aluminum alloy used in aerospace structural components. The 6X designation refers to the heat treatment process that brings the aluminum to its maximum strength specification. A 7070F6 lower is meaningfully stronger than a 6060 aluminum lower, which is what you will find in many budget R15 builds at this price point. The difference matters most at the pivot pin, and takedown pin lugs the stress concentration points where lower receiver cracks typically originate after high round counts. The gas system on the ZN-15 is a standard direct impingement system. And I want to address that directly because some of you are already thinking about the fouling argument. Direct impingement routes propellant gas directly into the bolt carrier key, which means carbon deposits accumulate inside the carrier and on the bolt tail. This is real and it does require regular cleaning. However, the mil-spec tolerances on the ZN-15 mean the system continues to function through more fouling before cycling issues develop than a budget R with loose tolerances. The gap between needs cleaning and stops working is wider on a proper mil-spec rifle than on a loose tolerance budget build. And here is something that does not get said enough about the direct impingement R platform in a long-term survival context. The gas system has almost no wear parts. There is no piston ring, no gas block seal to replace. The only gas system component that wears is the gas tube, and a gas tube failure is extraordinarily rare, slow to develop, and visible long before it becomes critical. In a decade-long scenario, the absence of piston wear is actually a durability advantage over piston-driven systems that have more components to eventually fail. Street price on the II. ZN-15 runs between $700 and $800, which puts it at the higher end of the budget category, but the build quality justifies the position. You are buying Carpenter on a 58 steel cold hammer forged barrel, mil-spec 77F6 receiver, and II Defense-Contractor quality control for less than the price of many R15 builds that offer none of those specifications. For an on-time, long-term investment, the ZN-15 is priced correctly for what it is. And here is your second open loop before we get into the top two. The number 2 gun on this list is an R15 platform rifle that does something the ZN-15 does not. It puts a chrome-lined barrel in a gun that costs $100 less. And the number 1 gun is not an R at all. It is a rifle with a pedigree that runs directly back to John Garand's operating system, the same principle that the U.S. military trusted to win World War II adapted into a modern package that most preppers walk right past at the gun store without a second look. Don't go anywhere. Number 2, Smith & Wesson M&P 15 Sport 3. Here is a question that most buyers never think to ask when they are standing at a gun counter looking at budget R15 rifles. Does this barrel have a chrome lining? Because the answer to that question, more than the brand name, more than the price point, more than the furniture, or the trigger feel, is the single most important durability variable in a long-term hard-use rifle. And when you start asking that question systematically across the budget R15 market, you find out very quickly that most manufacturers at the $500 to $700 price range quietly left the chrome lining out of their barrels to hit their cost targets. Smith & Wesson did not do that with the M&P 15 Sport 3. Let me put this in context before we go into the metallurgy, because I think the chrome lining story is one of the most misunderstood topics in the entire R15 market. When the U.S. military adopted the MiG-16 in Vietnam, early production rifles had non-chrome-lined barrels and chambers. The results in the field were catastrophic, not primarily because of the rifles themselves, but because the combination of the powder used in early Mod 83 ammunition, the humid jungle environment, and the absence of chrome lining in the chamber created a corrosion and fouling problem that caused rifles to jam in combat. The military's solution was to mandate chrome lining in the chamber and bore of all subsequent 16 production. That mandate has been in place for over 50 years and has never been reversed. Every M16, every M4, every military pattern rifle issued to American soldiers since the early 1970s has had a chrome-lined barrel. The military has had 50 years of operational data to reconsider that decision. They have not. Now let's talk about what chrome lining actually does to your barrel over a long service life. The chrome layer in a mil-spec chrome-lined barrel is electrodeposited to a thickness of between 0.0002 and 0.0005 inches, thin enough not to affect the dimensional tolerances of the bore, but thick enough to fundamentally change the surface properties of the steel. Chromium, as we discussed with the SK's barrel, has a Vickers hardness of approximately 1000 H. The carbon steel bore underneath it runs around 200 HVV. That surface hardness differential means you're rifling the spiral grooves that impart spin to the bullet is being contacted by a surface 5 times harder than the steel it is cut into. Every round you fire is a high-pressure, high-temperature event where hot propellant gases and a copper-jacketed projectile are traveling down your bore at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. Over thousands of rounds, that event erodes the bore. Chrome lining dramatically slows that erosion rate. Here is the practical implication: a quality non-chrome-lined barrel in hard use firing 1,000 rounds at a training course. 200 rounds monthly at the range will begin showing meaningful throat erosion somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 rounds, depending on the steel specification and heat treatment. A mil-spec chrome-lined barrel doing the same work will typically maintain acceptable accuracy past 20,000 rounds. In a decade-long SHTF scenario where you cannot order a replacement barrel, the difference is not academic. It is the difference between having a functional precision weapon in year 7 and having an oversized, inaccurate tube. The chrome lining also solves a second long-term problem that gets almost no attention: corrosion resistance inside the bore. A non-chrome-lined steel bore within hours of exposure to humidity, if it is not properly oiled and protected, in a field environment, rain, river crossing, humid storage, sweaty hands, maintaining a perfect oil film inside your bore is not realistic over a decade. A chrome-lined bore is essentially impervious to rust. The chromium surface does not oxidize under normal atmospheric conditions. You can leave a chrome-lined barrel wet for days and find nothing but surface moisture when you dry it. Leave a non-chrome-lined barrel wet for the same period and you find rust. The M&P 15 Sport 3 also ships with a chrome-lined chamber, not just the bore. This matters because the chamber is the highest stress, highest temperature, highest fouling area in the entire barrel assembly. Carbon and copper fouling accumulate in the chamber first and most aggressively. A chrome-lined chamber cleans faster, fouls slower, and resists the stuck case scenarios that can occur in a heavily fouled, non-lined chamber during sustained fire. Beyond the barrel, the Sport 3 runs a mid-length gas system longer than the carbine-length system on many budget Rs, which reduces the port pressure that the bolt carrier group experiences on each cycle. Lower port pressure means less violent bolt carrier travel, which translates directly into reduced wear on the bolt carrier key, the gas rings, and the buffer system over a long service life. It is a small detail, but in the context of a 10-year hard-use rifle, small's compound, the bolt carrier group is mil-spec, the lower is forged 7075 aluminum, and the trigger, while basic, is functional and durable. Smith & Wesson has been making M15 rifles for nearly 20 years, and the Sport line specifically has accumulated a massive real-world, round-count dataset from both civilian shooters and law enforcement agencies. The reliability record is not theoretical. It is documented across millions of rounds fired in the real world. Street price on the M&P 15 Sport 3 runs between $600 and $700, which means you are buying a chrome-lined barrel, chrome-lined chamber, mid-length gas system, mil-spec bolt carrier group, and the reputation of one of the oldest American firearms manufacturers for less than the cost of most non-chrome-lined budget Rs. For an on-time survival investment, the Sport 3 is possibly the most objectively correct value proposition on this entire list. Number 1, Ruger Mini 14. And now we get to the gun that most people walk right past in the gun store. The gun that gets dismissed because it does not look tactical enough, does not accept our magazines, and does not have a rail-covered handguard dripping with accessories. The gun that the prepper community almost universally underrates and almost universally underestimates. The Ruger Mini 14. And once I walk you through the engineering heritage of this rifle, I think you are going to look at it very differently. To understand why the Mini 14 belongs at the top of a long-term durability list, you need to go back to 1936. John Garand, a Canadian-born American firearms designer working for the U.S. Army, finalizes the operating system for what will become the Moan is a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle that uses a rotating bolt locked into the receiver via 2 opposed locking lugs. The gas system works by tapping propellant gas from a port near the muzzle, driving a piston rearward, which rotates and unlocks the bolt and cycles the action. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. The U.S. military carried it through World War II, Korea, and into the early stages of Vietnam. It was not replaced because it failed. It was replaced because the tactical requirements of jungle warfare demanded a lighter, shorter, magazine-fed rifle, which became the M14 and then M16. The M14 was a direct evolution of the Garand action, the same rotating bolt, the same gas system philosophy, scaled and refined for a detachable box magazine and a new cartridge. And when Bill Ruger set out in the 1970s to design a lightweight, affordable, semi-automatic ranch rifle for the American civilian market, he did not start from scratch. He took the M14 action proven across 30 years of military use, combat tested on multiple continents, and scaled it down to fire the 5.5 NATO 14. Mini as in a miniaturized M14. The name is not marketing. It is a literal description of the engineering lineage. So when you pick up a Ruger Mini 14, you are holding a firearm whose operating system traces its direct mechanical ancestry to one of the most extensively field-tested military rifle actions in history. That heritage is baked into every component. Now let's talk about what that means in specific technical terms for long-term survival durability. The Mini 14 barrel is chrome-lined from the factory on all current production models, not as an upgrade tier, not as a premium option as standard equipment. Ruger made the decision to chrome-line the Mini 14 barrel decades ago and has maintained that specification continuously. The barrel is also cold hammer forged, which gives you the same grain density advantage we discussed with the Ruger American and the Xeon 15. Cold hammer forged. Chrome-lined steel is the most durable barrel construction available on a production rifle, full stop. You are getting that construction on the Mini 14 at a price point that undercuts most comparable R15 builds. The gas system on the Mini 14 deserves particular attention because this is where the Garand heritage pays its most significant long-term dividend. The Mini 14 uses a fixed self-cleaning gas system with a short-stroke piston design. The gas port is positioned at the front of the gas block, close to the muzzle, which means the gas that enters the system has expanded and cooled compared to the high-temperature, high-pressure gas that would be tapped closer to the chamber. Cooler. Lower pressure gas carries significantly less carbon particulate, which means less fouling deposited in the gas system on every cycle. The piston itself is a simple steel rod that does not contact the bolt carrier group directly in the same fouling-prone way that a direct impingement carrier key does. The operating rod, derived directly from the Moen Garand design, transfers energy mechanically rather than pneumatically, keeping carbon deposits as out of the interior. This is fundamentally different from the R15 direct impingement system, where gas is routed directly into the receiver and deposits carbon inside the bolt carrier and on the bolt tail with every single shot. The Mini 14's operating rod system keeps all of that carbon forward of the receiver in the gas block and on the piston face, where it is easy to access and clean and where it causes zero wear to the bolt or bolt carrier. In practical terms, this means a Mini 14 that has not been cleaned in 500 rounds will still cycle reliably in conditions that would have a comparable direct impingement R15, starting to show symptoms of carbon-induced timing issues. In a decade-long scenario where cleaning supplies are limited, and cleaning time is a luxury you may not always have, that fouling tolerance is not a small advantage. It is a survival-critical feature. The receiver on the Mini 14 is investment cast stainless steel or chrome moly steel, depending on the variant, with the ranch rifle stainless model offering the highest corrosion resistance of any rifle on this list. Investment casting produces a receiver with no internal voids or porosity, maintaining consistent strength throughout the entire structure. The stainless steel composition adds an additional layer of passive corrosion resistance that does not require any coating to maintain, unlike blued steel or even nitride-treated surfaces which can be compromised by abrasion. The stainless receiver resists rust without any surface treatment at all. The trigger group on the Mini 14 is also worth noting for its durability characteristics. It is a simple, robust design with a low parts count, fewer springs, fewer pins, fewer potential failure points than the R15 fire control group. The components are dimensionally generous and tolerant of dirt and debris in a way that tightly tolerant trigger components are not. It is not a match-quality trigger, but it is a trigger that will function in mud, sand, and cold temperatures without inducing malfunctions. Accuracy on the Mini 14 has historically been criticized. Early production models had thinner barrels that heated quickly and shifted point of impact during sustained fire. Ruger addressed this directly in 2005 with a significant product revision that increased barrel diameter and stiffness across the Mini 14 line. Current production Mini 14 rifles are consistent 2 to 3 MDOT performers with quality ammunition, which is more than adequate for hunting at practical field ranges. In a survival context, 2 MOA accuracy from a chrome-lined, self-cleaning Garand action rifle is not a compromise. It is a completely acceptable trade for the durability and reliability characteristics this platform provides. Magazines deserve a mention here as well. The Mini 14 feeds from Ruger factory magazines 5, 10, and 20-round options, as well as aftermarket 30-round magazines from manufacturers like ProMag and Ruger's own higher capacity offerings. These are not as universally available as R15 SHTF magazines, which is a fair criticism. However, Ruger factory magazines are extraordinarily well made, and a reasonable stockpile of 5 to 10 quality magazines represents a multi-decade supply for any realistic survival application. Street price for the Ruger Mini 14 ranch rifle runs between $500 and $600 for the blued steel model and between $600 and $700 for the stainless model. For a cold hammer-forged, chrome-lined, self-cleaning gas system rifle with a direct mechanical lineage to the Moen Garand, one of the most combat-proven operating systems in the history of military firearms, that price is not just reasonable, it is extraordinary. This is a rifle built to be handed down to your children and still be functioning at full specification when they pass it to theirs. So let's bring this together, because the 8 guns on this list share a set of principles that are worth naming clearly before we close out. The Mossberg 500 and 590 earn their place through mechanical simplicity. The fewer moving parts a system has, the fewer parts that can fail. The Ruger 1022 earns its place through caliber economics and blowback reliability. A gun you can afford to feed for a decade is worth more than a gun you cannot. The SKs earns its place through Soviet overbuilding. Chrome-lined barrels and long-stroke pistons designed for soldiers who could not clean their rifles for weeks. The Ruger American earns its place through the fundamental superiority of bolt-action longevity. A gas system that does not exist is a gas system that never earns its place by filling the hand-ton gap. Earns its place. SHTF list ignores an all-steel, 50-year, proven pistol built for generations of hard use. The ZN15 earns its place through Defense-Contractor standards applied to a civilian price point. Carpenter on a 58 steel, cold hammer forged barrel, 77 FET6 receiver. The S&W M&P 15 Sport 3 earns its place through the chrome-lined barrel that most of its competitors at the same price point quietly left out. And the Ruger Mini 14 earns the top position through the combination of everything: chrome, hammer-forged barrel, self-cleaning Garand-derived gas system, stainless steel receiver option, and a mechanical heritage that has been combat-proven across 80 years of continuous military use. The thread connecting all 8 of these guns is that they were built by engineers who understood that a firearm is a long-term mechanical system, not a disposable consumer product. In a world where the supply chain still functions, the difference between a well-built gun and a poorly built one is how often you are annoyed at the range. In a world where the supply chain is gone for a decade, That same difference is whether you can defend your family and feed yourself in year 9. Buy once, buy right. Buy durable. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 8 guns is already in your survival loadout? And more importantly, is there a budget gun you think belongs on this list that I did not include? Drop your picks in the comments below. I read every single one. And the guns that get mentioned most often in the comments become the research list for the next video. If this breakdown was useful to you, the subscribe button costs you nothing, and it is the single best way to make sure you do not miss the next deep dive. We are going to be doing a full metallurgy breakdown of chrome-lined or nitride or cold hammer forged barrels head-to-head, round count to round count, and that video is going to change how you evaluate every rifle purchase you make going forward. Stay prepared, stay analytical, and I will see you in the